Imagine a midnight fog rolling over the long walk at Windsor. The air is cold, biting, and carries the weight of a decision that has been centuries in the making. In the high windows of Adelaide Cottage, a single light remains on. Prince William, the man who now holds the invisible ledger of the monarchy's survival, is not looking at old photos or sentimental letters. He is staring at a legal document, a decree of finality that will sever the last remaining thread between the Crown and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. This is not a tantrum. This is not a brotherly spat. This is the no-return order, a verdict that marks the end of an era and the beginning of a cold, calculated new reign. 4 years, the world watched the back-and-forth drama like a never-ending soap opera. We saw the interviews, the memoirs, and the subtle jabs hidden in palace press releases. But behind the scenes, William has been building a wall, brick by brick, fueled by a habit he learned from the greatest sovereign in history, Queen Elizabeth II. He learned that the crown does not collapse from external attacks. It collapses when the center cannot hold, when trust is auctioned off for a Netflix deal, and when the sanctity of the royal seal is traded for a headline in Montecito. The £12.3 million that once sat in the royal funds, meant for the protection and service of the UK, has become a point of silent fury. While the King, Charles III, has tried to keep a door cracked open out of a father's lingering hope, William has seen enough. He has watched his father's health fluctuate under the stress of betrayal. He has seen the institution he was born to protect being picked apart by those who chose celebrity over service. Tonight, that door is not just being closed. It is being locked, and the keys are being buried under the weight of a future king's resolve. Welcome to the real story of the year 2026. A year where the masks have slipped entirely, and the fairy tale has officially ended. William has issued the shock verdict. The eviction is final. Harry and Meghan are no longer just stepped-back members of the family. In the eyes of the future king, they are now outsiders, permanently barred from the inner sanctum of the Windsor dynasty. But what drove William to this point of no return? Was it a single lie, or a mountain of financial evidence that forced his hand? Will the public see this as a cruel purge or a necessary cleansing of a corrupted system? If you believe William is right to protect the crown at any cost, comment firmness. If you think blood should always come before the institution, comment family. Stay tuned, because what William found in the confidential files of the Duchy of Lancaster will change everything you thought you knew about the Sussexes' exit. The silence in the prince's study is heavy, broken only by the crisp sound of paper turning. William isn't looking at tabloid rumors. He is dissecting an audit report that has been kept off the official records for months. As the future king, he has gained access to the deep layer transactions of the sovereign grant and the private estates. What he found wasn't just a loss of money. It was a map of calculated extraction. Records show that even after the high-profile exit in 2020, silent channels remained open, conduits meant for security transition that were instead used to fund a lifestyle of global celebrity. William's eyes fixate on a series of transfers totaling over £5 million, disguised under consultancy for Commonwealth outreach. The recipients? A network of shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands with links so thin they practically vanish when scrutinized. For William, this is the ultimate betrayal of trust. While his grandmother, the late Queen, worked to preserve every penny for the service of the people, it appears a portion of that legacy was being drained to fuel a PR machine designed to attack the very family that provided it. The tension at the palace reached its breaking point when a leaked internal email surfaced, titled "The Cost of Silence." It wasn't from a staffer. It was a memo from the Sussex legal team, subtly implying that the price for their discretion was a continued flow of financial support. To William, this felt less like family support and more like a ransom. He remembered the cold discipline of his grandmother. You are either in or you are out. There is no middle ground where you can throw stones at the castle walls while still expecting the king to pay for your security. When William confronted the king with these files, the atmosphere in the room turned to ice. Charles, ever the father, wanted to see it as a misunderstanding, a clerical error. But William stood his ground. He pointed to the cancelled royal engagements, the empty chairs at state functions, and then back to the impersonal bank statements. He told his father that the monarchy is not a private bank for estranged relatives. It is a public trust. If the crown is to survive a 21st century world that demands transparency, it cannot afford to harbor shadows. This was the moment the no-return order was drafted. It wasn't just about moving furniture out of a cottage. It was about moving the Sussexes out of the royal future entirely. The order explicitly bans any use of royal titles for commercial gain and terminates all secret financial ties. William is not just closing a door, he is building a fortress. Do you think William is being too cold? Or is this the only way to save the monarchy from bankruptcy of both money and morals? Comment justice if you support the audit, or mercy if you think he should forgive the debts. We reveal the secret phone call from Montecito that triggered the final explosion at Windsor. The clock on the mantel of the king's private study struck 3 in the morning when the encrypted line began to glow. This was the phone call that would change the history of the Windsor dynasty forever. On one end, in the quiet darkness of Windsor, sat Prince William, his face set in a mask of cold determination. On the other, thousands of miles away in California, was Harry. But this wasn't a call of reconciliation or brotherly concern. It was a desperate attempt to negotiate the non-negotiable. Harry spoke of legacy and family birthrights, but his words fell on ears that had grown deaf to the Sussex narrative. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply laid out the cold, hard facts he had found in the audit, the leaked memos, the redirected funds, and the exploitation of the royal seal for commercial clout. The Prince of Wales was no longer the protective older brother. He was the future king acting as the ultimate gatekeeper of the monarchy's integrity. The turning point came when Harry mentioned a new media project that would once again tell their truth. In that moment, the last fragment of William's patience shattered. He realized that for Montecito, the crown was not a sacred duty, but a product to be sold to the highest bidder. William's response was short, sharp, and carried the finality of a guillotine. The bank is closed. The house is gone. The door is locked. This was the no-return order issued in real time. There would be no more state-funded security, no more grace and favor residences, and no more silent bailouts from the Duchy of Lancaster. William was doing what the palace machine had been too afraid to do for years. He was cutting the cord. He understood that the monarchy cannot survive as a harmless fairy tale if it allows its foundation to be looted by those who claim to have left it. As William hung up the phone, he didn't feel a sense of victory, only a heavy, chilling clarity. He walked to the window and looked out at the vast, silent estate. He knew that by morning, the lawyers would be dispatched and the eviction notices would be served. The new king had just issued his first true verdict, and the shockwaves were about to hit both sides of the Atlantic. Do you think William's no-return order is a move of strength to protect the UK taxpayers, or a cold act of sibling rivalry? Comment king if you stand with William, or brother if you think he went too far. We reveal the secret documents Meghan left behind at Frogmore Cottage that contain the most explosive secret of all. As the eviction notice was served, the physical world of the Sussexes began to be dismantled with a clinical, almost chilling efficiency. Moving vans lined the driveway of Frogmore Cottage, but this was no ordinary change of residence. For Prince William, this was a forensic operation. He knew that while the monarchy always presents a perfect stage to the public, it is what happens behind the heavy velvet curtains that determines the ultimate fate of the throne. He wasn't just clearing out a house. He was scrubbing a potential security threat from the heart of the royal estate. In a hidden compartment of a desk once used by Meghan, a digital storage device and a series of handwritten journals were discovered by a senior security detail. These were not just personal reflections or diary entries. They were what internal sources are now calling a shadow manifesto. The documents detailed a cold, multi-year strategy to build a rival royal court in North America. It was a blueprint designed to use confidential palace protocols, private family schedules, and even the sacred traditions of the crown as raw material for a global commercial brand. But the most explosive discovery within those files was a list of names. It was a roster of internal palace staffers, people who had sworn an oath of loyalty to the king, who had been quietly feeding information to the Montecito team for years. This was not a family disagreement. It was institutional espionage. William sat in silence as he reviewed the notes, which described leveraging the crown's perceived fragility to increase the valuation of media deals. He realized that the privacy the Sussexes had demanded was merely a shield, used to control their own reality while they systematically picked apart the foundations of his. The discovery of the Shadow Manifesto changed everything. It transformed William's no-return order from a disciplinary measure into an unbreakable law of survival. He understood now that silence was no longer a viable option. If a future king has to overrule his own heart and his own father to protect the sanctity of the institution, then that is a burden he must carry. The files proved that the Sussexes didn't just want a new life in the sun. They wanted to own the narrative of the British monarchy itself. William immediately ordered a total security purge of the staff mentioned in the documents. The mask had slipped, and underneath was a calculated plan to monetize a legacy that had taken centuries to build. The Prince of Wales knew that if he allowed this to continue, he would be handing over the keys to the kingdom to those who had already proven they were willing to sell its most guarded secrets. The atmosphere inside the walls of Buckingham Palace shifted from professional decorum to a state of high-alert security almost overnight. Prince William, now acting with the cold clarity of a sovereign who has seen the enemy within, did not wait for a committee or a formal debate. He understood that a system is only as strong as its most vulnerable link, and according to the Frogmore files, those links were everywhere. The list of names, the internal moles who had been trading royal secrets for California favor, was now a roadmap for a purge that would redefine the royal household for a generation. One by one, senior aides and long-term staffers were summoned to a private room in the West Wing. There were no cameras, no lawyers, and no polite conversation. William sat behind a heavy oak desk, the Shadow Manifesto laid out before him like a death warrant for their careers. He didn't ask for explanations. He presented evidence. He showed them the timestamps of leaked private conversations that mirrored the exact timing of Sussex media releases. He showed them the digital footprint of encrypted messages sent from within the palace gates to offshore servers. For William, this was the most painful part of the execution of his no-return order. These were people who had eaten at the royal table, people who had been trusted with the safety of his children and the health of the king. To see their names attached to a plan designed to leverage the crown's fragility was a blow that severed his last remaining sense of familial safety. He looked at these staffers not just as employees, but as the silent architects of a betrayal that had left King Charles fighting for his legacy while fighting for his life. The verdict was immediate and non-negotiable. Resignations were signed on the spot. Non-disclosure agreements were reinforced with the threat of criminal prosecution, and security passes were revoked before the staffers even left the room. William was making it clear, the era of the palace machine acting as a double agent was over. He was resetting the monarchy's script, replacing the old, porous walls with a fortress of absolute loyalty. As the sun set over London, the halls of the palace felt emptier, but for the first time in years, they felt secure. The Prince of Wales had proven that he was willing to lose his own staff and his own reputation to ensure that the institution would not be sold from the inside out. The new king had removed the rot, leaving a chilling silence where betrayal once whispered. Thousands of miles away, in the sun-drenched hills of Montecito, the silence from London was becoming deafening. The digital lines that had once hummed with whispers from within the palace went cold, one by one. Meghan and Harry soon realized that this wasn't just another administrative shuffle. It was a total communications blackout. The moles they had relied on to stay ahead of the royal narrative had vanished, and for the first time since their departure, the Sussexes were flying blind. The no-return order had reached across the Atlantic, not as a letter, but as an invisible wall that cut off their most valuable currency, insider information. Inside their California mansion, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of panic. Without their eyes and ears inside the gates of Windsor, their upcoming media projects, designed to offer fresh truths, were suddenly hollow. They had built a brand on being the only ones who knew the secrets of the crown, but William had just changed the locks on the vault. The realization hit like a physical blow. The future king had not just evicted them from a cottage. He had evicted them from the conversation entirely. They were no longer the rival court they had envisioned in the Shadow Manifesto. They were becoming mere spectators of a monarchy that no longer recognized their existence. Sources close to the couple describe a weekend of frantic strategy meetings. The initial reaction was one of pure, unadulterated fury. Meghan, ever the strategist, reportedly argued that William's ruthless purge was a gift, a clear example of the toxic palace environment they had always warned about. They prepared to launch an ultimate retaliation, a media blitz that would frame William as a cold, heartless dictator who was tearing a family apart while his father was at his weakest. But even as they drafted the statements, a chilling thought began to take root. Would anyone still believe them if they no longer had the insider proof to back it up? For Harry, the pain was more personal. He saw the names of the fired staffers, people he had known since childhood, and understood that William had not just fired employees. He had burned every bridge Harry had left to his old life. The new king was sending a message that resonated through every corner of the Montecito estate. If you are not with the crown, you are against it. There was no more gray area, no more half-in, half-out compromise. William had forced them into a corner where their only weapon left was their own voice, and that voice was beginning to sound increasingly isolated in a world that was growing tired of the royal drama. As the sun dipped below the horizon in California, a new plan began to take shape, a high-stakes gamble to bypass William and appeal directly to King Charles. But little did they know, William had already anticipated this move. The blockade was not just about staffers and bank accounts. It was about the very heart of the king himself. The confrontation was moving from the ledger of the Duchy of Lancaster to the emotional battleground of the Windsor family, and the stakes had never been higher. The high-stakes gamble began with a single, unlisted phone call directed toward the private quarters of King Charles. Harry knew that the no-return order was William's creation, a fortress built on cold logic and financial audits. But he also knew that Charles was a father first, a man who had spent a lifetime caught between his duty and his heart. This was the strategy from Montecito, to exploit the emotional cracks in the crown's foundation, hoping that a father's love would overrule a king's decree. However, the gates of Windsor had become more than just physical barriers. They were now a digital and administrative shield managed by William's hand-picked loyalists. Every message, every letter, and every request for a private audience was filtered through the new king's office. When Harry's request for a secret meeting reached the palace, it didn't end up on his father's bedside table. It landed directly on William's desk. The Prince of Wales looked at the request not with anger, but with a chillingly calm resolve. He realized that the Sussexes were trying to use the king's illness as a tactical advantage, a move that William viewed as the ultimate moral failure. The confrontation that followed within the palace walls was silent but devastating. William reportedly presented the king with a new contingency plan for institutional stability. It wasn't just a policy, it was a psychological intervention. He showed his father that every time the door had been left ajar, the Sussexes had used that opening to drain the royal assets and leak private vulnerabilities to the highest bidder. William argued that to protect the king's legacy, they had to protect the king from his own empathy. He forced the institution to admit its own mortality, that if they did not cut the cord now, the monarchy would bleed out long before the coronation was over. The blockade was now absolute. William issued a formal directive. All communication with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was to be handled via legal counsel only. No more private calls, no more Zoom sessions with the grandchildren, and no more informal visits. The emotional battleground had been cleared. William was no longer just the heir. He was the acting regent in all but name, a man willing to be the villain in Harry's story to ensure there would still be a story for the crown. As word of the total blockade reached California, the desperation in Montecito turned into a dangerous kind of silence. Harry and Meghan realized that the father they had hoped to manipulate was now entirely surrounded by the brother who had vowed to stop them. The final bridge had been burned, and the smoke was visible across the globe. William had successfully isolated the infection, but the world was left wondering. What happens when those with nothing left to lose decide to burn it all down? The silence from Montecito was finally broken, not by a phone call or a legal letter, but by the subtle, calculated deployment of the nuclear option. Meghan and Harry, realizing that William had successfully severed their internal palace connections, decided to pivot their strategy toward the court of global public opinion. They knew that if they couldn't reach the king's ear, they would speak to the king's subjects. The strategy was clear. If William wanted to build a fortress, they would make that fortress look like a prison to the rest of the world. A series of high-level meetings were held with major U.S. media executives to coordinate a global broadcast event. This wasn't just another interview. It was a counterstrike designed to frame William's no-return order as a cruel and unusual punishment. Internal memos from the Sussex camp, later uncovered by investigators, referred to this as the sympathy offensive. The goal was to paint a picture of a grieving son and brother being systematically erased from his own heritage by a cold, calculating future monarch who valued power over blood. Meghan reportedly took the lead in crafting the narrative, focusing on the emotional toll of the eviction. They prepared to release unseen footage and personal recordings that they claimed would prove the coldness of the new regime at Windsor. By humanizing their struggle and casting William as the ruthless architect of exile, they hoped to spark a public outcry that would force the king to intervene. They were betting on the idea that the British public, despite their loyalty to the crown, would not tolerate a king who allowed his own family to be cast into the wilderness without mercy. But William, ever the analyst, had already prepared for this media blitz. He didn't respond with his own interviews, he responded with data. He authorized the controlled leak of the audit findings, the evidence of the shell companies, the redirected funds, and the shadow manifesto. He chose to fight their emotion with his facts. By the time the Sussexes launched their sympathy offensive, the public had already been primed with the reality of the financial betrayal. William was playing a game of chess while the Sussexes were still focused on the drama of the soap opera. As the two sides prepared for the ultimate collision, the monarchy stood at its most fragile point in decades. The battle was no longer about a cottage or a title. It was about the very moral compass of the British people. William had drawn a line in the sand, and as the first salvos of the Sussexes' retaliation hit the airwaves, the world watched to see if the fortress of the new king would hold, or if the walls of Windsor would finally crumble under the weight of its own secrets. The media blitz from Montecito was in full swing, flooding airwaves with emotional pleas and accusations of a heartless monarchy. But while the Sussexes were playing to the cameras, Prince William was preparing to strike the final blow in a war of information that they could not win. He understood that in the modern age, a king cannot simply order silence. He must prove that silence was the only moral option left. This was the moment William authorized the financial transparency release, a move known internally as the Crown's Ledger. For the first time in history, the palace didn't just issue a vague statement of denial. Instead, they released a meticulously documented report that cross-referenced the Sussexes' claims of financial abandonment against the actual flow of funds from the Duchy of Lancaster and the sovereign grant. The ledger revealed a staggering reality. Millions of pounds had continued to flow into security and transition costs long after the couple had claimed they were cut off. The data was cold, clinical, and absolutely devastating. It showed that while the world was being told a story of struggle, the reality was one of continued, silent privilege funded by the British taxpayer. But the real checkmate came with the inclusion of the intelligence annex within the report. This section detailed the forensic link between the shell companies found in the Frogmore files and the specific media leaks that had targeted the Princess of Wales and King Charles during their most vulnerable health crises. William didn't have to call Harry a liar. He let the bank statements and digital timestamps do it for him. The evidence proved that the Sussexes weren't just victims of a palace machine. They were the ones who had been trying to dismantle it from the inside for profit. The public reaction was a seismic shift. The sympathy offensive from California collapsed almost instantly under the weight of the evidence. Supporters who had once championed the couple felt a deep sense of betrayal. The narrative of the rebel royals was replaced by the reality of a calculated commercial operation. William had successfully used the very transparency the public demanded to expose the lack of integrity in those who had attacked the crown. He had proven that his no-return order was not an act of sibling rivalry, but a necessary act of national and institutional defense. As the news cycle turned against them, the isolation in Montecito became absolute. The high-level media executives who had been eager for a global broadcast event began to quietly distance themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a brand that had been so publicly debunked by the future king. William had not just won the battle for the truth. He had destroyed the Sussexes' ability to sell their story ever again. The fortress of Windsor was no longer under siege. It was the only thing left standing in a landscape of ruined reputations. The dust has finally settled over the ancient stones of Windsor, but the landscape of the British monarchy has been altered forever. The no-return order was never just about a legal eviction or a financial audit. It was the first defining act of the William era. As the gates of the palace were metaphorically and physically sealed, a new kind of silence took hold, one that wasn't built on secrecy, but on the chilling clarity of a clean slate. Prince William has proven that the crown is no longer a family business that can be manipulated by emotion. It is a national institution that demands a price of absolute loyalty. In the final days of this purification, the last of the Sussex influence was systematically erased from the official royal records. The titles remain in a state of permanent suspension, the digital archives have been locked, and the shadow manifesto has been placed in the secret vaults of the Round Tower, serving as a silent warning to any who would dare to monetize the throne again. William has successfully executed a moral reset, signaling to the world that under his watch, the crown will not be sold, it will not be leveraged, and it will not be held hostage by the threat of a tell-all interview. For King Charles, the resolution brought a bittersweet peace. Though the father may grieve the loss of a son, the king has found a renewed strength in the unwavering resolve of his heir. The monarchy has emerged from this crisis not weaker, but more resilient, having survived its most dangerous internal threat since the abdication of 1936. The public support for the new king's firmness has reached unprecedented levels, proving that the people value integrity over the hollow glitz of celebrity royalty. William has shown that he is willing to stand alone in the light of truth rather than hide in a palace of comfortable lies. As the cameras pan away from the locked gates of Frogmore Cottage and the silent halls of Buckingham Palace, the message to Montecito is final and absolute. The story has ended. There are no more chapters to leak, no more secrets to sell, and no more bridges to burn. The bridge is gone. The era of the global royals has collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving only the steady, cold, and transparent reign of the House of Windsor. The year 2026 will be remembered as the year the monarchy stopped explaining itself and started protecting itself. William has stepped into the role he was born for, not with a crown of gold, but with a shield of iron. The gates are closed, the ledger is balanced, and the no-return order stands as the final verdict of a future king, who chose the survival of the crown over the comfort of his own blood. The new era has begun, and it is an era where duty is the only currency that matters.